Ladies and gentlemen, I know you've all been having a wonderful lunch because the noise level and conviviality has been of a very high level. But I think we should move on, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ian McKee, who is our speaker and very well known to a Scottish audience in one of his many guises. Ian was born in South Shields, which, for those of you who don't know, is just south of Newcastle. He's a Geordie. I know that because my wife was also born in South Shields, but she calls herself a Weirsider. Ian and I, we have opposition because I went to Mercus and he went to Fettes College, and at least we didn't have Tony Blair as one of our... He also went to Edinburgh Medical School, and there's a little question for you here, ladies and gentlemen. He's wearing a very special tie, and you've got to, it's the Edinburgh Medical School tie, and I will tell you what it represents after his talk. He then did some hospital jobs. He spent 5 years in the RAF, and then he became a very distinguished and superb general practitioner in Sighthill and Wester Hales. He's well known as a medical journalist. He's written in the Scotsman, the Edinburgh Evening News. What better is there than the Edinburgh Evening News? And the Scottish Daily Record, I gather, amongst others. He then became a Scottish National Party MSP in the Parliament from 2007 until he retired earlier this year. He is well known for one of his major comments in a debate in the Parliament when he said, "I am an Englishman." I don't know how well that went down, Ian, in the Parliament. He's a trustee of the Lord Provost One City Trust, which was founded to fight social exclusion in the city. And he was awarded an MBE last year for services to healthcare and medicine in Edinburgh. It's my very great pleasure to invite Ian to speak to us.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think yours. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the honour and opportunity of addressing you today. Is this working, by the way? Yes. The General Council is the physical manifestation of the great family of Edinburgh graduates scattered throughout the world, a family to which I have belonged for more years than I care to remember, and my father before me, only exceeded by my wife, Penny, who's actually graduated 3 times from Edinburgh University. In changing times, family ties are more important than ever, and we are indeed fortunate to be able to maintain our links throughout our lives with the university to which we all owe so much. It gives me a special pleasure to be speaking in the Michael Swan building. I think one of the signs of growing old is when buildings are started being named after people you know. And I have special regard for Michael Swan because he gave me my very first lecture in university in the zoology building 52 years ago. And that lecture will remain in my mind for the rest of my life because barely had it begun when the doors burst open and a crowd of people all rushed in, some student demonstration we assumed, and created mayhem, and then they all went out again. Michael Swan had sat down while this was going on, and then he stood up and said, "Now, will you tell me how many people were in that demonstration? What were the placards saying? What were they chanting?" Of course, none of us knew. And he said, "The first important thing, if you're going to be doctors, is to learn the art of observation." As you know, I worked for the greater part of my professional life as GP in Edinburgh, and then at an age when most of my contemporaries were enjoying the fruits of their retirement, entered the Scottish Parliament for 4 years as members for Lothian. you may well ask as to what induced someone to move from an occupation still held in some regard into one which ranks below tax collectors and traffic wardens in the public esteem. Certainly, probably that's the reason I've been asked to speak today, to explain myself. And the truth is, I can't give a simple reason, it's multifactorial. But today, I would like to share some of my experiences and try to answer any of your questions later on. One of the very pleasant duties of a parliamentarian is to meet the children, usually towards the end of their time in primary school when they are most enthusiastic, and to have to answer questions on any subject they care to bring up. It's true, something happens to children when they become adolescents. I don't know what it is, but they're very enthusiastic in P6 and P7. On one occasion I was asked how you become an MSP, and I explained in great detail all the hurdles you have to go through. My answer was obviously far too complicated for one young man, who asked me a moment or two later, please, if you want to become an MSP, do you ask at the reception desk? If only. In fact, my first attempt was in 1999, when as a very raw candidate, I harangued a crowd of 5 or so on a windy street corner in Gorgie. After what I thought was an impressive political peroration on the benefits of independence, I asked for questions. An elderly lady immediately put up her hand. Dr. McKee, she said, I put my prescription in on Monday and it isn't ready yet. Can you chase it up, please? It wasn't helped by her later remarking to her friend in a loud voice, this is the only way you can see Dr. McKee without waiting 2 weeks. I failed to become elected that year, suffered the same fate in 2003, but at last was successful in 2007. It was hard work, with lots of canvassing, cold, windy, wet nights, with many disappointments. But I was lucky. Many people far more talented have never succeeded in being elected. So the day in May that I presented myself at the Parliament as a new member will remain in my memory for the rest of my life. So how different is the work? Well, as far as constituency casework is concerned, parliamentary duties are very similar to those of the GP. The same old problems, bad housing, noisy neighbours, barking dogs and so on, were expressed by people just like the patients I used to see. In fact, as I worked in Edinburgh, they were very often the very patients I used to see. The difference was that an MSP, I could get some action and very often help, whereas as a GP, sadly, my representations were more frequently turned down or ignored. And as an MSP, I had members of staff who could see that problems were followed up and who knew where to apply pressure for best effect. As a matter of interest, most of the problems that came my way were really the responsibility of councillors, and many of the rest, often immigration concerns related to reserved issues, but we tried to deal with them all the same. The big worry at the onset of my new career was how I would cope with parliamentary matters, being a new and very inexperienced politician at the mercy of aggressive, knowledgeable opposition members whose faces were familiar to me from their many television appearances. And my friends asked me how I could bear to expose myself to such unpleasantness. Yet the reality is very different. On my first day in Parliament as a new SNP backbencher, I was welcomed as I passed him in the corridor by Jack McConnell, still First Minister of Scotland at the time, who expressed a hope that I would settle in quickly. In fact, most politicians get on very well with each other, with only a few carrying their rivalries into their private dealings. So as the weeks passed, I began to realise that politics as a profession is altogether more congenial than politics elsewhere. Because it's a fact of life, isn't it, that politics exists in all spheres of activities. As a former doctor, I know all about medical politics, and those of you with a university background will be familiar with the sometimes cutthroat nature of the academic variety. But in Parliament, we've all chosen to be politicians. It's what we want to do, whereas in most other walks of life, the politics is thrust upon you whether you like it or not. And those who dislike or hate politics and are not good at it may well suffer very badly in their careers as a consequence, whilst others, sometimes unfairly, reap the rewards. In the debating chamber last session, I had the unnerving experience of regularly addressing an audience, the majority of whom want me to fail and were only too happy to knock me out of my stride. Yet, as they are political professionals, they appreciate the various tactics you employ to keep your political wicket intact. Accepting interventions is dangerous, as the intervener may well ask a question which throws you completely, yet it's a sign of cowardice always to refuse them. You may be fortunate or knowledgeable enough to know the answer to an intervention, but it's best to have a few stock retorts at hand, such as the old chestnut, "I'm not taking lessons in economics, health, education or whatever from a member of a party which made such a mess of these matters when it was in government," although more original ones are better appreciated by the cognoscenti. What you must avoid at all costs is simply to gape like a goldfish at the audience when you're stumped. And even after vigorous and heated exchanges, it's still possible to meet up afterwards and discuss football or whatever. No day in the Scottish Parliament is the same as any other. There is always something new coming along. I still remember with embarrassment the day I was asked by my chief whip to have lunch with a group of Uruguayan MPs. The Parliament always liked a member from each of the main parties to help host such an event. None of them spoke English, but they were accompanied by a rather frosty-faced lady from the Foreign Office who acted as an interpreter. However, all male MSPs present could not help but notice a strikingly attractive young girl sitting quietly at the end of the table, and who was obviously one of these MP's assistants. To my surprise, at the end of the meal, this young girl made a beeline for me, and looking deeply in my eyes said, "I very much hope that if you come to Uruguay, you will come to see me." "Of course I will, my dear," I said, clasping her hand and mentally trying to remember which airline went to Montevideo and when I could get away. At this stage, however, I must confess that a slight frisson of concern clouded those wonderful eyes. "I am only interpreting," she said, and sure enough behind her was a tall, huge, bearded Uruguayan MP, nodding his head vigorously. Most people seem to think of Parliament in terms of debates in the chamber, or heaven forbid, First Minister's question time, but it is in committees that most of the work is done, and where an observer has at least a chance of seeing committee members working together and setting their party allegiances to one side. Not always by any means, but it happens. And witness sessions, when committee members grill the great and the good, often with surprising results, can be fascinating. As an example, when I was on the End of Life Bill Committee last year, we took evidence from representatives of all the major religions, humanists, ethicists, medical and nursing organisations, and doctors from countries which allow euthanasia. We went into topics such as the concept of the just war, or whether medical ethical advice should always follow changes in the law. It was absolutely fascinating, yet rarely do members of the public sit in on such committees, or I suspect even know they can. However, although I'm a fan of the committee system, I must mention what seems to be a major defect in our parliamentary process. Unlike at Westminster, the Scottish Parliament does not have a revising chamber. Instead, the various committees are meant to scrutinise thoroughly all legislation as it passes through the system. Now, you might have read recently in the papers about concern that, with the SNP winning an overall majority in Parliament, this scrutiny will be less effective, as the composition of the committees mirrors that of parties in the Parliament, and so the government will always have a majority of committee members. I think it's a mistake to assume that this particular concern applies only to this session. After all, from 1999 to 2007, the Labour Lib Dem government had a similar majority on all the committees. And from 2007 to 2011, when the government was in a minority, the opposite danger emerged, that on crucial issues the committee should be whipped by the opposition parties, could be whipped by the opposition parties to oppose legislation on purely party political grounds. For example, I am convinced that this happened when the alcohol bill came to the Health Committee. Nearly all the evidence taken by the committee pointed to the benefits of minimum unit pricing of alcohol, yet opposition members were whipped to oppose, and did so. Two other drawbacks of the committee system also arise when it comes to scrutinising legislation. In the last session, I, along with Richard Simpson, also an Edinburgh graduate and a former president of the SRC, we were the two doctors out of the 8 members of the Health Committee. And I think I can safely say, and I hope it doesn't sound too immodest, that our background was an enormous help to the committee when taking evidence or considering reports. We knew the right stones to turn, where the bodies were hidden sometimes. Yet it was purely by chance that there was anyone with a health background on a committee, and the same goes for other specialist committees. and with the tendency of people to come to Parliament with a background only in university research and party politics and without any experience of the world outside, I think this situation is likely to get worse. It's true that committees can appoint specialist advisors, but the pot of money available for this purpose is incredibly small, and such advisors are usually only appointed for very specific tasks, such as scrutiny of the budget. The other deficit is a limited time available to perform all committee functions. For example, the Scottish health budget annually is more than £10 billion, but our committee was expected to assess government spending proposals critically in a few hours of meetings spread over 3 or 4 weeks. Nor do committees have time to undertake post-legislative scrutiny. Did that legislation work as intended? We simply don't know and haven't the time to find out. We hear that in this session, the Parliament is going to examine how it conducts its affairs. I personally think that it will be a mistake to give much more time to business in the chamber. Debates are very often turgid affairs, with the outcome usually predetermined. Instead, I think that committees should be given more time to scrutinise legislation, perhaps even sitting whilst debates are going on in the chamber. And whilst I agree that in a democratic society the composition of committees should reflect the political balance in the Parliament, I suggested committees should be able to co-opt non-voting members who have specialist knowledge of the subject under scrutiny. I'm no fan of the House of Lords, but one cannot deny that in its members chosen for their eminence in a multitude of fields, not the ex-politicians or hereditary peers, it provides a pool of expertise well suited to revise legislation produced sometimes in relative haste in the lower house. Should we institute a Senate of wise, experienced people from all walks of life to provide such a pool of expertise in Scotland? These are just random thoughts as a result of 4 short years in the Parliament. But what about me personally? What have I been able to achieve as a humble backbencher? Can one individual out of 129 MSPs make a difference? A kindly clerk in the Parliament Library unearthed the fact that I had contributed to 125 debates in that time, more than any other member. A lot of hot air, if nothing else. I've mentioned the casework, which on occasion produces gratifying results. There are also campaigns in which I've been involved, such as that to save the Hill End ski slope or local post office foreclosure, which have been successful. There is the help I could give to organisations I personally support. For example, I sponsored events for Scottish Opera, St Mary's Music School, and Lone Parent Fathers. I even opened a hotel, but before we get carried away with that, this was a hotel for frogs. I was invited to the Rebel Wall Garden, where they wanted to encourage a frog population, so they had this idea to get publicity of having a frog hotel. And a big hole in the ground with 2 levels on it. You could lift the top off to see the frog bedroom. They had a red carpet leading down to the hotel, and a sign saying, "Rooms by the hour, day or week, guaranteed dark, wet and cold." And I had to cut a tape, and as I cut it, a frog hopped down. Anyway, you do strange things as an MSP. And whilst I didn't have the opportunity, or perhaps the drive, to sponsor a major piece of legislation as a private member's bill, I was able to effect modest but important change. I've managed, for example, to strengthen regulatory advice given to teachers concerning the duty of confidentiality they owe their pupils. I had 8 words deleted from the public health bill. Only 8 words, but words which could have wreaked havoc had they remained. And I've managed to persuade the full Parliament to have a whole paragraph added as late as stage 3 to another health-related bill. I've rebelled against my party whip on 4 occasions. I've joined a select group of 2 of us who've actually only had 1 person voting for our motion in Parliament, that's oneself. And I frequently criticised some of the policies of my own government and speeches in the chamber, but survived to tell the tale. And finally, I've succeeded by persistent agitation committee in diverting £4 million of government expenditure into what I regard as more worthwhile areas of activity. Not exactly the sort of achievements which will make the grandchildren swell with pride when they ask, "What did you do in the Parliament, Grandpa?" I'm afraid, but a source of modest satisfaction nonetheless. And for me, above all, I enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian, for that amusing and wide-ranging talk. Now, I'm sure there are lots of questions, and there is a roving microphone which Mary has. Who would like to make a comment or ask Ian a question? You blinded us with silence. Right, here's one here. There's a microphone coming over to you. Oh, yes.
Thank you for that interesting talk. I was moved to wonder, in your dealings with the authorities and people outside Parliament, do you have any fruit from work with the local churches, or maybe the mosque, or whatever, that side of the community life?
Yes, I was, as I said, a list MSP, and therefore I dealt with people from a variety of organisations all over Lothian. I had several discussions with people from religious organisations, especially with my position on the End-of-Life Assistance Bill Committee, because of course you can imagine that was something which people became very moved about. But I was also on a cross-party group. There's different cross-party groups in the Parliament on poverty, and the Church of Scotland provided the secretariat for that committee. So we were involved with churches and religious groups in that sort of field of work as well.
Any other comments, questions? Right, there's one there, and then there's another one there.
You spoke about the whips. I just wondered if the whips become too strong in the Scottish Parliament?
I think that's a bit of a controversial issue, whether the whip is needed or too strong. I think, and I'm out of the Parliament now, so I can make my views plain. I think the whipping system has a great deal for it in some ways, because it helps sort out an awful lot of issues, like who's going to speak in debates and so on. And it's only very, very rarely are you going to come foul of the whipping system, in my experience. But I think the whip is a good idea to give you a feeling of the way your particular party, political movement is wanting to go, as long as you keep your integrity and independence, to the extent that if you're being pushed into something which you really totally disagree with, then you shouldn't go along with it. It's like if you're playing in a team sport. There's sometimes you do things in a team sport which maybe seem a bit dull, but you're doing it for the team, and if you all work together, you can succeed more than if you're all trying to do your own individual thing. But if you, as I say, if your whip tells you that you must vote in a certain way on an issue which you feel really strongly about, then I, for one, wouldn't and haven't done that. And I think that's important.
You seem to be quite keen on the idea of having a second chamber in Scotland, the Scottish Senate or something like that. This was discussed, you probably remember very well, in the early 1990s, and there were two strong points of view then, pro and against, and the pros won. I've never been convinced, having followed the Scottish Parliament a bit since then, that it was better to have yet another elected body. How would you elect them, for example? Who would they be? Who would pay for them? The taxpayers, I suppose, as usual. Surely it's better to increase the number of committee members. I think you mentioned 8. There used to be 11. I think they started with 13. To have more committee members who could do more revising work, and particularly post-legislative scrutiny, which you mentioned, which I'm very strongly in favour of.
Well, I was giving the early vestiges, if you like, of a line of thought rather than giving you a complete proposal. As far as the Senate is concerned, I think people would be prepared to do that for nothing, as officially people in the House of Lords do it for nothing. They just fiddle their expenses. And I think in Scotland, I think we now have a very tough expenses. I mean, I couldn't buy a cup of coffee for someone unless very well-defined circumstances. So I don't think it would cost a lot. I agree. How do you appoint people, etc.? Having 11 on a committee, apart from the fact that with 128 active MSPs, well, and then some of them off in the government, that would be quite difficult to do. I think if you have 11 people without certain in-depth knowledge of what you're discussing, it's not much better than 8 people without in-depth knowledge. I mean, the help that Richard Simpson and I were able to give was we'd worked in the health service. When someone came with an idea which was patently rubbish, we could see that, and often other people couldn't. It sounded quite reasonable. And then we could ask the questions which hopefully highlighted it wasn't such a good idea. But if you just have 11 people who've maybe all been party researchers or something, I don't know if you'll necessarily end up. I still think on a committee the vote should be according to the elected members, because that's democracy. But I'm just anxious to find some way whereby people helping ask the questions, or people have a certain knowledge of the field about which they're discussing at the time.
Any other? Bruce? All right, yeah.
I'll just ask one question. Would you agree that legislation made in haste tends to be bad legislation? I'm thinking of the Scottish Government's anti-sectarian legislation.
Yes, I'd completely agree with you. I don't see how the anti-sectarian legislation that's being produced at the moment adds anything. I mean, the law is fairly clear at the moment, and I find quite a bit of difficulty in how you actually define legally sectarianism. I mean, if a person is at a football match and shouting support for the Republic of Ireland, that overtly isn't overtly religious at all, is it? And yet we tend to use sectarian or religious. Now that might be a surrogate for a religious fight, but it certainly isn't openly, and therefore if someone's criticising the Pope, perhaps they can be had up for sectarianism, but if you're supporting the IRA, would that be proven in court that you were sectarian, and so on? And there are plenty of offences of breaches of the peace, etc. So I think this is an example of a bad piece of legislation, quite honestly.
Bruce?
Well, I just wondered how you felt the significant majority the SNP now has will affect the character of debate and committees, etc., in the Parliament.
We'll have to wait and see. As I said in my talk, we've had 8 years when the Lib Dem Labour coalition had a majority on the committees in the Parliament, and for 4 of those years there was a Lib Dem, an ex-Lib Dem presiding officer, because the presiding officer changes his or her party status. So we've been through this before. I think it's a big risk if you try and use your majority to steamroller things through, because I think apart from any higher aspiration, I think the people of Scotland won't forgive you if you show that people don't like bullies and people who just say, I'm not going to listen to you, and you probably might well not agree with me, but I think that's one of the reasons the Labour Party have done so badly, because in Scotland they've tended to be a bit bully, and I think there's always the risk that if you've been in power for a long time, in absolute power, you become absolutely corrupted, and I think that's a lesson we've got to learn. So I do hope very much that the party which I'm still a member of, but no longer a parliamentarian, will heed the lessons of the past and try to take people on board and take advice from others. But whether the temptation to exercise your power will become too great, we'll just have to wait and see.
I just wondered if you would have could, I mean, persisted in standing, if the electoral system had still been first past the post in the Scottish Parliament, and what do you think about that kind of system in comparison with the AV?
Well, firstly, let me say I think there's no perfect method of electing people. I think the AV system was a total red herring, really. I didn't like the first past the post system. I mean, when if you take Edinburgh Council, before it turned over to single transferable vote, you needed about 15,000 people to vote in an SNP council and something less than 2,000 to vote in a Labour council, and that didn't seem fair. In fact, there was a whole period when we didn't have one SNP council despite getting thousands and thousands of votes. The trouble with the single transferable vote is obviously you need multi-member constituencies and you run the risk of losing a bit of the tie with your individual member. They tried to get round of that in the Scottish Parliament with what they call a D'Hondt system, whereby you get the top-up from regional members, and I think that's got grave disadvantages as well, not least of all that it's the party that's choosing the people on the list, and therefore there are certain individuals that know in a year's time they're going to be an MSP without having to work hard at all, and I think that's wrong as a principle. So on balance, although there is no perfect system, I personally prefer the single transferable vote and multi-member constituencies. Now you asked me a personal question, do you mean would I have stood over the last 10 years for the Parliament to be first past the post? It's very difficult to say. I think I would have done, although I wouldn't have expected to get in. I mean, in the constituency where I've lived and worked, what was Edinburgh Pentlands, now I think it's called Edinburgh Southern, no one ever thought there would ever be an SNP MSP there, and this year there is. So strange things happen in politics. But I think that the single transferable vote is the fairest way of reflecting the opinion of the electorate as a whole.
Right, now I'll ask Dr. Frank Stewart to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Ian, for a fascinating talk. You've given us a lot to think about. An emeritus professor of this university once said to me that his experiences in Sicily in wartime, leading a small unit, were excellent and relatively mild preparation for academic politics. And it may be that Ian's experiences as a GP in Sighthill and in Wester Hailes, the sort of experience which I have shared in my professional life, were also good preparation for politics. Ian, however, has always had an astute mind and a very strong political conscience. As an undergraduate, he was actually being paid because he had joined the RAF on a short service commission, which seems to me to have been a very astute move, and it's one which I don't think Ian has ever regretted. His strong political conscience also came to light at an early stage when he stood as our class representative on the Students' Representative Council. I think that was probably the first election you stood in, and I could still remember that. Ian has given us a lot to think about, a very entertaining and very thoughtful talk, and I'm sure you'll wish to join me in thanking him most sincerely.
You will have gathered from that, ladies and gentlemen, that Frank and Ian were in the same year at Edinburgh Medical School. Now, I did mention Ian's tie earlier on, and you may have noticed that it has very strong colours, red, purple and yellow, and they represent in the medical profession blood, liver and pus. So I'm glad you finished your lunch. Now, we've had a wonderful lunch here, and I would hope that Steve McLaughlin and Simon Bates would pass on our grateful thanks to all the people in King's Buildings who have given us a memorable day today. thank you all for coming, and I would remind you that our 2 next meetings are in February in the Old College, and next June we will have our Out of Edinburgh meeting in Brussels, and I promise you, those who have not been to an Out of Edinburgh meeting, it is well worth going to. Now the tours of King's buildings are going to start, so you need to make your way down to the ground floor foyer, and the meetings will start in about 10 minutes. Anyway, I hope you've all enjoyed your lunch, and I wish you a safe journey home. Thank you and goodbye.
This production is copyright the University of Edinburgh.